You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string. It makes his little
Good morning, America, from the great state of Idaho and the great states of Montana. I want to welcome our listeners to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. This morning we are going to have a really interesting show because we're doing a special on Halloween on secret societies and on the various Illuminati and some of the other societies that have shaped the history of the United States and influence our political process today in ways that most people have no idea. But before we start that, we've got a kind of a special guest this morning, a lady who is a good personal friend who has been very involved with the national security issues for quite a long time. And she is on the air with us today, and she's going to do a very brief announcement of some very important information that's come to light, and is going to preview our show that we're going to do on Thursday night on the Republic News Network. So, Mary, are you on the line? Doesn't sound like maybe Mary is on yet. I will try to see if we can somehow get her on the line. We do have John McManus is on our line today. He's going to be our guest for 2 hours with Alex Newman. And John, are you on the line? It sounds like we're having some technical difficulty here. Maybe it's just my microphone or my headset is not picking up our guests. Let me see. I'm going to get off the Skype, and I'm going to try the landline and see if that improves things a bit.
Are you there, Dan? Hello, Dan. Okay, well, while I'm waiting for Dan, for those of you that are on the phone lines, please don't hang up, because when I pushed the button, you were already on the program. Now I don't know who's on what line, so creating our own problems here. Let me put this on here until we get something straightened out.
Okay, Joe, am I on?
There was a mighty
can you hear
nation.
me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you fine, but the problem is people that are calling in on the phone lines, I just hooked them up, and then they were listening to music, and they don't think they're on the air, so they cut the line, call in another. So I don't know who's on what line at this moment.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm sorry for the mix-up here, ladies and gentlemen, but who is on the line with us right now?
Oh, now, okay, here's the lady that I think is on this line is supposed to be here for the first 10 minutes. Okay,
right.
So,
okay, that would be Mary Fanning.
Okay, here's Mary. Mary, are you there? Okay, Mary, are you on this line?
I'm on number 3.
Okay, you're on number 3. Okay, here's Mary.
All right, good. Well, we've got Mary on the line. Mary, we had kind of an introduction, but I didn't go into a lot of detail because I want you to be able to tell our listeners exactly what you've been working on over the last 9 months. In fact, you've been working on it much longer than that, but especially hard over the last 9 months, and some of the things that have come to light as a result of your efforts. And we had a discussion in the previous show talking about EMP and how the electrical system could be taken down from within by people trying to imply that it's an EMP attack. I would like to give you 10 minutes to give our listeners a little bit of an idea of what your what research has come up with, and then we'll do a prelude for the show on Thursday. Mary, are you still there?
Are you still with us, Mary?
I certainly am.
Can you not hear Dan?
I cannot hear Dan at all.
Uh-oh. Okay, that's a problem. I'm going to get on the phone. I'm going to hang up from Skype, and I'm going to get on the phone, and that way maybe we can hear one another.
Still cannot hear Dan.
Really understand sometimes what a terrible burden it is to know some of the things that I know. And try to wake people up and impart this knowledge to them. And find out that they just have walls built in front of them. They want to be slaves.
Now I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's no longer a theory. What I'm about to say is fact. The secret organizations of the world power elite are no longer secret. They have planned and are now leading us into a one-world communist government.
Journey with me deep inside the rabbit hole. Wake up, my friends, there's some things that you have to know. Everything you ever thought you knew, it has to go. For instance, NASA is the world's largest magic show. 9/11 was a planned demolition and Sandy Hook was a scam. Come on, man, are you tripping? Constant programming being crammed in your vision. Just take a step back and examine this prison. Turn on the news and they're trying to blind you. All they ever do is tell you lies and divide you. There's nowhere you can even hide, they'll find you. Illuminati all-seeing eye right behind you. It's about time you find out we're being lied to. They're attempting to control the mind that's inside you, hide you from the power that designed you. Does anybody have a problem with this? Well, I do. I want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They say they got it, but they're never coming up with proof. If you're looking, then they got you jumping through these hoops. The lies always continuing to rise and busting through the roof. I want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They say they got it, but they're never coming up with proof. If you're looking, then they got you jumping through these hoops. The lies always continuing to rise and busting through the roof. They're lying to us about everything. How can this be? I know I'm not crazy, and yet I'm questioning my sanity. I see what the Illuminati's doing to humanity. The truth is stranger than fiction. We're living in a fantasy. What I'm witnessing is unreal. It's a one-way battle for us cattle going uphill. If we don't stand and fight now, then no one will. Our children will never know freedom. It's a done deal. The future's not looking so promising. It's the poor who go to war while the rich keep on profiting. It's us that they're slaughtering and money that they're honoring. And soon it's gonna be the new world order that they're offering. It's mind-boggling how so many don't seem aware. And if they are, it's like they really just don't even care. Our world is broken and I'm hoping it can be repaired. But we'll have to fight for it, so just be prepared. I want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They say they got it, but they're never coming up with proof. If you're looking, then they got you jumping through these hoops. The lies always continuing to rise and busting through the roof. I want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They say they got it, but they're never coming up with proof. If you're looking, then they got you jumping through these hoops. The lies always continuing to rise and busting through the roof.
Forget the politicians. Politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. And they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking.
Okay, for Dan's guest here, hang on with us here just another minute. I think we'll have this all straightened out, so just bear with us, please. Thank you.
Okay, Joe, I'm on Skype.
There was a lawyer once. His name was Francis Scott Key. He penned a song that I'm sure you're aware of. You've seen it. It's in most hymnals throughout our churches. It's called the National Anthem. It is our song as an American. We go, however, to a ball game. We stand in our church services and we sing the words of that song, and they float over our minds and our lips, and we don't even realize what we're singing. Most of us have memorized it as a child, but we've never really thought about what it means. Let me tell you a story. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Baltimore. The colonies were engaged in vicious conflict with the mother country, Britain. Because of this conflict and the protractedness of it, they had accumulated prisoners on both sides. The American colonies had prisoners and the British had prisoners. And the American government initiated a move. They went to the British and they said, let us negotiate for the release of these prisoners. They said, we want to send a man out to discuss this with you. They were holding the American prisoners in boats about 1,000 yards offshore. And they said, we want to send a man by the name of Francis Scott Key. He will come out and negotiate to see if we can make a mutual exchange. On the appointed day, in a rowboat, he went out to this boat and he negotiated with the British officials. And they reached a conclusion that men could be exchanged on a one-for-one basis.
All right, Dan, are you there with me?
Scott Key, jubilant with the fact that he'd been successful.
This is Mary.
Yes, Joe, I'm on the line, and I'm not sure exactly what's been happening here, but apparently we're having trouble, a little bit of trouble getting the connections on. Is Mary on the line, and can she hear me?
Can you hear Dan, Mary?
Yes, I can. I'm on line 3, I believe.
Yeah, she can hear you now.
All right. Well, we're having some some growth pains here. But Mary, I kind of gave a little bit of a lead-in for you, but Mary Fanning is one of the lead researchers for the Center for Security Policy. She's been involved with many of the security issues nationally for quite some time. And she's been involved with we did a show almost a year ago now on the Port Canaveral, which was a whole port that was turned over to an organization that had very, very close connections with the Iraqi nuclear program and the lead scientist for the nuclear program. And Mary, I'd like you to give our listeners maybe a 10-minute prelude of what you want to talk about on Thursday night on our Connecting the Dots show on the Republic News Network.
All right. Hi, Dan. It's nice to see you, hear from you again. What we have is a new paper coming out at the Center for Security Policy. My writing partner and fellow investigative journalist, Alan Jones, and I have done another 10-month investigation, so altogether 3 years on Gulf Tainer. Gulf Tainer was handed over to the Jaffer family. One brother was under investigation by the Treasury Department and 4 congressional committees for selling Iraqi oil and the oil for super weapons program. That's Hamid Jaffer. His brother is Dr. Jaffer Dia Jaffer. Dr. Jaffer was Saddam Hussein's rogue nuclear mastermind. Now, we have another paper that's up at the Center for Security Policy. We actually bring our pieces to them. We do not work for them. The new piece is also how the CFIUS process would bypass and give a nuclear mastermind who was declared and designated by coalition forces as an enemy combatant who was arrested. That is the man who has been handed our port. Beyond that, we have found that the Jaffers have gone into a joint venture with Rostec, who owns Rafa Boron Export, and they are the people who export something called the Club K. The Club K is a container unit that opens up and it can shoot off ballistic missiles, take down an aircraft carrier, take out a city. When you understand that the Jaffers are partners with Russia in this, and that Dr. Jaffer is also the creator of the nuclear beach ball, it becomes a national security disaster. Beyond that, what happened? How did anyone hand a lease over to an enemy combatant? That takes place at the CFIUS process. Through the CFIUS process, they had a man named Eamon Mir that was sitting at the Treasury Department. He is the one that put the information together for the CFIUS board. Eamon Mir gave the CFIUS board incomplete information on the Uranium One deal. He told them it was Canadian, never mentioned Russia. On the Gulf Tainer deal, he never did the CFIUS at all, because it's important that they lied about the true ownership, who owned Gulf Tainer going into Port Canaveral. The Emir of Sharjah is also the part owner. But it's interesting to note, Eamon Mir came from Wilmer Hale. Who is Wilmer Hale? Wilmer Hale is the law firm of Robert Mueller, and many of the people that he's brought to investigate Donald Trump come from the Robert Mueller law firm. Eamon Mir is a young man who never had any national security background whatsoever. He was an immigration attorney for people from the Middle East looking for asylum in the United States. He was also the youth director of something called ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. Who else is in ISNA? Well, his father and his father's partner were the founders of ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. His father's business partner, Mr. Fay, F-A-I, he is also a man that was arrested by our federal government, put on trial, and put in prison because he was handing out $300 million to our officials. And it was found that Mr. Fay was working for the Pakistani ISI, their intelligence. Basically, that's where we're going in the story that you will hear about on Thursday night.
Okay, Mary, that's a very succinct description of what's going on. And one of the things that we need to be made aware of is that through this Club K, through these containers, that they can be literally through the various Gulf ports and especially Port Canaveral, which is controlled by the Kuwaitis. We can have these containers literally all over our country, and who knows what is inside some of those containers.
Well, two things. The Obama administration stopped inspecting any containers. It had been 4%. Congress mandated 100%, and they stopped doing any. Some of them were being done offshore. So Jay Johnson changed the rules on what was to be inspected, even though Congress had mandated 100%. Beyond that, as these containers come into the country and not being checked, they get on flatbed trucks, they get on trains, they get on riverines, so they have access to every port in the United States, every road in the United States, every train in the United States. Beyond that, we have something called inland ports that were put through that are now foreign owned, and that they run those areas known as inland ports. In fact, where the Vegas shooting was is an inland port.
Okay, well, Mary, we're going to have to get back with our regular program. I appreciate you coming on, and I want people to understand this telecast, this broadcast will be on Thursday night on the Republic News Network, and you can go to republicoftheunitedstates.org, and that will give you instructions on how to get on that radio program so that you can listen live to Mary and to Alan Jones. Mary, thank you for being on our show, and
thank you, Dan.
I look forward to this dialogue that we'll have on Thursday night.
We'll talk on Thursday night.
All righty. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Goodbye.
Okay, John McManus is our guest tonight or today for the radio show on our special on Halloween and the secret societies and the organizations that are literally manipulating and controlling much of the political process in America. John, are you on the call?
Yes, I am. I'm right here.
Ah, wonderful. Good, clear connection too. John, I'd like, first of all, I'd like to introduce you, but I would like you to give a little bit of your background and a little bit of information on some of the things that you've done in your life and how that has influenced your research and your understanding of the American political mess that we have right now.
Well, if you want a little background about me, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I attended and got a degree from Holy Cross College in Massachusetts. I went into the United States Marine Corps as an officer for 3 years. In 1960, I took a job as an electronics engineer. In 1964, I joined the John Birch Society. In 1966, the Birch Society hired me. I gave up my career as an electronics engineer. And I've stayed with the Birch Society all these years, more than 50 on the staff. That's my service with the Society started off as a field coordinator in New England, covering several New England states, building the Society as best we could. In 1968, I was asked to transfer into the headquarters, which then was in Belmont, Massachusetts. I became a junior executive and then a senior executive, and I became the Society's public relations director in 1973. I served in that position until 1991 when I was named the president of the Society. Not the top officer. The top officer has always been a CEO, but I was number 2 in leadership. I've written several books. I've made many videos. I've been on radio shows from coast to coast, hundreds, maybe even thousands. I'm glad to be with you, Dan.
John, and I really appreciate having you on because you're such an articulate, intelligent man. You have so good background information on so many different subjects. But the subject for today, the secret societies and your understanding of the history and how all these things come together, it's very much appreciated on this Halloween day. And I would like to ask you to start out with maybe a bit of a discussion on just exactly what Halloween is.
Well, my understanding of Halloween is that it is All Hallows evening, the evening before All Saints' Day. The Catholic Church has always celebrated All Saints' Day on November 1st. And so the day before it was Hallow evening, All Hallows. All Saints, All Hallows are interchangeable terms. There's a Catholic tradition that said that the saints, and there are many thousands of saints that have been declared saints by the Catholic Church, that the saints can be appealed to for assistance in your life and in your wants even more effectively on the day of All Saints' Day, which is November 1st. So if you have a particular devotion to St. Francis and you happen to live in Assisi in Italy, then you would have even more likelihood of assistance from that saint in heaven. So in order to besmirch the Catholic view on this subject, the idea of ghosts and goblins returning on All Saints' Day was started, and that's where the ghosts and the goblins have come out of the Halloween, the evening before All Hallows' Day, All Saints' Day. And so in some respects, it is a sneer at the Catholic Church, and of course, almost all the people who celebrate Halloween today have no idea of that and certainly don't intend to offer an insult to the Catholic Church. But that's how it started, and it has certainly grown. Today, Halloween is celebrated by more people than is Easter Sunday, when Christ rose from the dead. Now, I'm telling you what I know about that. This is not John Birch Society doctrine. This is just John McManus speaking. The Society itself has never taken a position on defining what Halloween is all about. But I managed to let you know that I had a view on that, and you asked for it, so you've gotten it. And that's what Halloween started out as, and it's become quite harmless, really.
Well, it certainly is a good lead-in for our discussion today on these secret societies, because a lot of things that are going on in our government today didn't start out exactly the way they have turned out. And All Hallows Eve, Halloween, being turned into basically a pagan holiday, rather than a religious holiday, is typical of much of what's happened in our country.
That's true. And Dan, there's an interesting feature on that. I'm talking to you from an office that I hold in Massachusetts, and I'm not far away from Salem, Massachusetts, where the famous witch trials were held many years ago. That's another story in itself. But anyhow, currently, there is a woman in Salem, Massachusetts, who pretends to be a witch, and she's simply got a money-making scheme out of it. But Salem, Massachusetts has become a haven for a lot of people who believe in Satanism, and it's fairly destructive. If I lived in Salem, Massachusetts, I would not be happy about all of these people claiming to be Satan worshipers in my midst. But anyhow, that's what goes on in Salem, Massachusetts. It's a big day for them. A lot of tourists come, and there's a lot of commercialism going on about it. But that's kind of the thing that happens when a rumor gets going.
Well, you're right, and incidentally, I have to tell our listeners this. I became a huge fan of the John Birch Society not that many years ago, because a lot of us have heard the propaganda out of the globalists, the Illuminati, and the groups that would prefer communism to our constitutional Republican form of government. So they've created a kind of a black eye and made the John Birch Society sound like a bunch of right-wing extremists, that they have extreme views that are totally different than what you would call the mainstream. And the bottom line is the John Birch Society just wants us to protect our freedoms and go back to the constitutional Republican form of government that we so much started out this country with. And they are very anti-communist because they've seen the increase of communism, and through the UN and other organizations, how our system of government has really changed as a result of influences that are very negative to the freedom and the liberty that's part of our constitutional Republican form of government. John, I just had to make that statement because, there are a lot of people that have a lot of misconceptions about the John Birch Society, and it is probably one of the most patriotic organizations in the world, certainly in the United States. And so let's start with a discussion about the origin and purpose of the organization known as the Illuminati, and its founder, Adam, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but Weishaupt. It's Weishaupt.
A correct pronunciation would be Weishaupt, as if it started with a V. The German W is really always a V.
Okay.
Weishaupt.
John, would you, since you understand how to pronounce it, maybe you can put a little flesh on the body here and explain what the Illuminati is and how it got started and how it's influenced our national government since the very beginning.
Well, the Illuminati was formed on May 1st of 1776 by a man named Adam Weishaupt, as we've already discussed. Weishaupt was a professor at a Catholic university in Ingolstadt in Germany. And while he was teaching there, he grew a severe hatred of the Catholic leadership of that university. And he decided that he was going to reshape civilization. There aren't too many people that start off something by saying that their goal is to reshape civilization, but Weishaupt was a brilliant man and an evil man. So he formed a secret organization called the Illuminati on, again, May 1st of 1776. The date, incidentally, is quite significant. It's why communists and socialists have always celebrated May Day. Most don't know that, but if you get into somebody who's in the hierarchy of the communist movement or the socialist movement, you would find that they're aware of the fact that they celebrate May Day because of the founding of the Illuminati. Communism and socialism, as we know it today, are descendants of the conspiracy of the Illuminati. So the Illuminati started in 1776, and Weishaupt was able to gather to his fold some other professors, and then at the Congress of Wilhelmsbad in 1783, a Congress of the Masonic lodges throughout most of Western Europe, Weishaupt was able to secure leadership. He wasn't even at the convention, but his people were, and they secured leadership for the Illuminati over almost all of the Masonic lodges in Western Europe. It finally became headquartered at the Grand Orient Lodge in Paris, and it spread its tentacles throughout the world. So the Illuminati existed. In 1798, there were two books written about the Illuminati. The first was by a professor in England named John Robeson, who had traveled through Europe frequently and himself was a Mason and was introduced to the thinking of the Illuminati while in the Masonic lodges, and he revolted from it, and he eventually wrote a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy. His book was read by George Washington, who, before he died, said that he was not at all unwilling to state that the doctrines of the Illuminati had not spread even into the United States. That was the first of the two books. We have republished that book, the John Birch Society has. It's called Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robeson, R-O-B-I-S-O-N, and it's certainly worth reading to find out how the Illuminati operated, what their goals were, and so on. The second book that was also published in 1798 was written by a French priest named the Abbé Augustin Baruel. He had fled France because of the French Revolution that killed many thousands of priests and certainly many more people beyond the priests and the nuns that they attacked. Baruel's book is much larger. It's actually a 4-volume work, and it has been published by a group in Michigan. I have a copy. I've read through most of it. And I know that what Baruel discovered and what John Robeson discovered is the same, although the two men never met. They both reported about the Illuminati and its effect throughout the world, and their information is in no conflict one to the other. So both of those books are worth reading about the early history of the Illuminati. And there have been numerous people who, throughout the years, have discussed about the fact that the Marx movement, the communist movement that was begun by Marx and Engels in 1848, is actually an outgrowth of the Illuminati conspiracy, hatched in Bavaria in 1776. Weishaupt was going about his organization and recruiting people to it when one of the couriers for the Illuminati was traveling from one place to another in Bavaria and was struck by lightning and killed in an accident. Well, the authorities went and found out a lot about the Illuminati from the papers that the man was carrying, and the head of the government in Bavaria at the time thought it so serious and so much a threat to civilization that he forbade membership in the Illuminati under penalty of death. And at that point, Weishaupt left southern Germany, went into northern Germany, Saxe, Coburg, Gotha, and continued his work. Why don't we stop there a second, and maybe, Dan, maybe you want a little amplification on some of what I've already said.
I guess the main thing that we need to understand is that, number one, the Illuminati and the Weishaupt were both concerned about creating a system of communism, and they were also very Christian, anti-Catholic church, and as a result of the discussions that they created, it was the beginning of the communist movement before Karl Marx, and Karl Marx actually is an offshoot of the original Illuminati creed. So I guess that's an important thing that our listeners need to understand. They need to also understand that we've got a whole bunch of other organizations that have gone off of the original Illuminati organization. Alex Newman, are you on the call?
I know that Alex will be joining us, but I guess he's not there yet.
He's not here yet. Okay. What I wanted...
Dan, let me go back and add to this a little bit now.
Okay.
In the early 1800s, remember now, the Illuminati started May 1st, 1776. In the early 1800s, there was a competitive movement started in Italy by a man named Giuseppe Mazzini, Mazzini. Mazzini started an organization called the Carbonari. And the Carbonari had the same goals as the Illuminati, but he devoted all of his attention on the country of Italy, at least for a time. Mazzini eventually went to London and teamed up with Karl Marx before Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. I don't know how much of a hand that Mazzini had in the writing of it, but he was friendly with Marx, and they both had the same goal. So the continuity from the Illuminati to Mazzini and the Carbonari up to Marx is pretty easy to show. And that's what I have just discussed here. There are several aspects about the Illuminati and about the Carbonari in Italy that are important. One of them being its determined effort to destroy the Catholic Church. Certainly, Weishaupt wanted to do that. He knew the Catholic Church from having taught at the Catholic University there in Ingolstadt. So he grew to hate the Catholic Church, and he wanted very much to destroy it and to destroy civilization in the process. So there are lots of people who have written about the Illuminati over the years, and we can discuss those, but maybe we ought to back up again here now and ask for you if you have any anything you want qualified or expanded upon.
Well, John, I guess what I would say is, first of all, Arthur Thompson, the president of the John Birch Society, has written...
CEO. He's CEO.
He's the CEO. Art has written a book called To the Victor Go the Myths and the Monuments, and a lot of this information that you're giving us right now about the Carbonati and the Illuminati are in his book, and it's not an easy read, but there's an awful lot of really valuable information on how these connections can be made with our early attempts by people like George Washington to create a truly free society, how some of these people were already trying to, disassemble the brilliance of our Constitution and of our Republican form of government.
That's true.
John,
yeah.
Would you like to talk about how really so many of these organizations now have become part of the system of so-called world government, our move toward globalism, and how so many of these organizations have been promoting that system for very long, and now how close it really is?
Well,
hey, Dan, I'm on the line, by the way. So.
Is that Alex?
That is me. Yep. Sorry, I think we've had some technical difficulties, but I'm here now. So.
Okay, good, Alex. Well, have you been able to hear any of the discussion we've had thus far?
Yes, I heard you guys talking about the Illuminati, and that's funny. I was just giving a speech on the Illuminati and other things last night, so good conversation.
Okay, well, Alex, I didn't get an opportunity to introduce you, but Alex Newman is an international journalist. He's written for a number of publications, including the New American. Alex is also a scholar and a writer in his own right, has written several books or co-authored, and Alex is very deeply involved in, let's say, the re-education of our youth to a system of education that isn't based on the teachings of some very poor ideas under a collectivist system. Alex, would you maybe expand a little bit on that, just a little in your background, and then I'd like to have you enter the discussion on the Illuminati.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for that kind introduction. And as you mentioned, I'm a journalist. I write for the New American magazine and different clients. And education is kind of where I've focused a lot of my efforts in recent years. I think I have an interesting perspective, maybe just having been overseas almost my whole life, living in 7 or 8 different countries on 4 different continents, and so back in America now, and working best we can to save freedom in America, because if it goes down in America, it goes down everywhere, and so we have a long battle ahead of us, but exposing the subversive forces that are trying to build a totalitarian global system is, the place to start. So.
Okay, well, Alex, would you maybe like to join in on the discussion about the Illuminati? You just had a program that you did on the Illuminati, and maybe you'd like to share some of your thoughts on what we've already talked about.
Sure. Well, I think Jack hit all of the really big points, and I relied very heavily on John Robison's book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, in what I had to say yesterday about the Illuminati. It's a fantastic book. I didn't even read it until this year. I think I finally finished it, but it has so much insight, and the fingerprints of the Illuminati are unmistakable when you look at the modern, globalist, socialist, communist movement, and it's hard to trace a direct line, just because, by nature of what we're talking about here, we're dealing with secretive people who try to act in the shadows, people who are doing wicked things and don't want to be exposed doing those wicked things. So just by virtue of the subject we're dealing with, there's a lot of uncertainties, a lot of questions: who was involved, what exactly happened. But it's such an important subject. And 2 of the other secret societies I was talking about yesterday in my talk about the deep state and then the deep state behind the deep state are the Skull and Bones. And there's a lot of speculation, and I think it is speculation, that Skull and Bones may be in some way linked to the remnants of the Illuminati. Actually, the founder of it founded it at Yale after returning back from Germany. And they have, in some ways, as best as we can tell, similar ideologies, a similar obsession with death. The Skull and Bones, they have this giant skull and crossbones for their logo, and a lot of very prominent members, and a lot of very bizarre occult rituals. And they operate just like the Illuminati did, as best as they can, in secrecy. And this is the kind of stuff that the American people need to be aware of. And I was talking about the Bohemian Grove too, and we know some about the Bohemian Grove now, thanks to things that people who have attended have told us. Alex Jones, the radio host and the journalist, he actually snuck in there some years ago with a video camera and filmed these people doing bizarre occult rituals, wearing weird robes in front of a 40-foot stone owl. And you can watch this video on YouTube. It's just unbelievable. The supposed leaders of the world, presidents and prime ministers and CEOs and mega bankers and secretaries of state and treasury and defense, all getting together and running around naked in the woods and paying obsessions to this 40-foot stone owl. And they were burning what they said was a human effigy. There's this blood-curdling scream that you hear as they do this weird ceremony. And the American people need to realize that, hey, these are your supposed leaders. They're doing occult rituals in the forest of California in front of a giant stone owl. So everything is not as it seems. And, diagnosing the problem starts with getting an understanding that, these people are up to no good. There's a reason they hide in the shadows, right? If you're doing good, you don't normally have to hide in the shadows while you're doing it. And, I think the fact that there is so much occultism and so much secrecy should alarm all Americans.
Yeah, Alex, I agree with that completely. And the thing is, these secret societies, they claim to be for the good of us, but if they're for our good, why are they secret? That's the question. And incidentally, I'm gonna list off a few. This certainly isn't all of the secret societies, but I'm gonna list off a few, and then we can do a little further discussion of these. Certainly, the Masonic orders. There are some that are just great. I know a lot of Masons that are really good, but there were some Masonic orders in Europe, and some of them are continuing that aren't necessarily for our good. Fabian Society, the Round Table Group, Cecil Rhodes and Milner's group, the Council on Foreign Relation and their British counterpart, the Royal Institute for International Studies, the Bilderberger Group, the Skull and Bones, the Bohemian Grove, which Alex you just mentioned, the Trilateral Commission, for that matter, the Federal Reserve, because it certainly, a lot of its workings are certainly secret. Some of the UN leadership groups are very, very secret. Tax-exempt foundations and the NGOs that we have in our country are certainly secret in some of their operations. And the one that never gets discussed, but I think is one of the most important one, is the Club of Rome, because they really are the reason for the birth of the radical environmental movement that now pretty much consumes most of our education system in this country. So, John, would you like to maybe start and go ahead and talk about some of these groups?
Well, I wanted to mention something here. We got away from it, but I wanted to mention that we talked about John Robeson's book. Alex has mentioned that as well. It is an important thing to read to understand what's happening. George Washington left the presidency in 1797. He had served 8 years, and he was in semi-retirement when somebody in Maryland sent a copy of Robeson's book to George Washington. And he read it. And he wrote back to the man who had sent it to him, who was a Reverend Snyder in Fredericktown, Maryland, to thank him for the book. And he said in his letter, Reverend Sir, it was not my intention to doubt that the doctrine of the Illuminati had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more satisfied of this fact than I am. George Washington. And that was 1798. So George Washington was aware that the Illuminati had spread to the United States, was trying very hard to recruit and to establish itself as it had done in some other countries. I should mention here that its leadership ended up in Paris at the Grand Orient Freemason Lodge in Paris, and the destruction there occurred in 1789 with the French Revolution, from which France has never really recovered. They are still suffering the throes of what happened in the French Revolution of 1789. And there have been books written about that. One important book that certainly should be brought up in this discussion is a book published by a Catholic Monsignor named George Dillon. He wrote his book in 1885. Monsignor Dillon had discovered the Illuminati and its problems, and he had been giving lectures on the subject all over where he lived in Scotland and probably elsewhere, when he was ordered by Catholic authorities to put his thoughts in a book. And so he finally did. He wrote a book called The War of Antichrist with the Church, published in 1885. The book has been republished under the title Grand Orient Freemasonry Unmasked as the Secret Power Behind Communism. Now, again, this was 1885, Monsignor Dillon's book. And then we move ahead there, and we can go to people like even Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill spoke out about the Illuminati in 1920 as a young man. And I have some of his texts. He said in 1920, and his thoughts were published in the Illustrated Sunday Herald in London in 1920. He said, from the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization has been steadily growing. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. And now at last, this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people. He's talking there about the success of Lenin and Trotsky to take control of Russia.
Well, that, John, that is absolutely on the money, and all I want to maybe add to that statement is that we need to understand that these organizations have been working against us really in concert, even though they're not maybe totally connected together in any hierarchical manner, but they are working together to eliminate our Republican form of government.
This is The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
Okay, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. My guests today are Mr. John McManus and Alex Newman, and we're talking about secret society and the Illuminati and different organizations that have had an impact on our changes in our system of government from the very beginning. And Alex, I would like to get you into the discussion on this as well. I'd like to talk about how these organizations, how these different secret societies are actually grooming and creating our leaders that are put before the American public, and how the system has been corrupted in a way that our leaders are selected by forces outside of our control, and they're giving us the illusion that we actually have a voice in our own system. Alex, would you like to really discuss that?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Dan. I mean, you must have been reading my mind. This is exactly the topic of the presentation I was giving yesterday. Fascinating coincidence that we're talking about it again today. But, I mean, there are so many individual examples that I could give. So I'll give a couple and then move into, the bigger picture. And let's focus in on Bilderberg, just because it's one of the more influential of these organizations. I wouldn't say it's technically a secret society. They even opened up a website in recent years, just maybe to deflect all the accusations that they were being overly secretive. We still don't really know what goes on in there. They put out a partial membership or a partial list of attendees. I know from having gone to some of these, not obviously as an invited guest, that they don't always put on all the people who are attending. To give you an example, I got the list one year, and Bill Gates was not on it, and then we found Bill Gates sneaking in. So, there's a lot of this going on. They don't tell everybody who comes. But the Bilderberg Group is really interesting. These are really some of the most influential people in the world, many of them. I saw a really interesting graphic that the Business Insider had put together, which is a pretty mainstream online publication, showing the connections between attendees to Bilderberg and basically all the organizations, companies, governments, et cetera, that they lead. And you have basically all the influential institutions of society covered when you take all the Bilderbergs together. And so I want to give a couple examples of this. You talked about these secret organizations picking our leaders for us. The Bilderberg offers a number of incredible examples. Take Bill Clinton, for example. He was virtually unknown outside of Arkansas, some kind of perverted, weird governor with a weird wife, obviously. And, outside of Arkansas, he was a nothing. Nobody even knew his name. Mainstream Americans had never heard of him. Then he went to Bilderberg. And mysteriously, very shortly thereafter, he was paraded on all the fake news media. I think CNN recently got upgraded by President Trump to very fake news, and that's appropriate. But so all the fake news, had Bill Clinton on there promoting him as if he'd be some kind of great down-to-earth kind of president guy. And that's just one of the many examples of this. Same thing happened with Tony Blair, who ended up becoming the Prime Minister of Britain. Same thing happened with Mario Monti, who just out of the blue was installed as the Prime Minister of Italy. And the same thing happened with Barack Obama. He snuck off to a secret meeting of the Bilderbergs in Chantilly, Virginia, duped all the reporters. Right? They had to tell the press pool, "Oh, everybody get on the plane. Mr. Obama will be right here." And he slithered away off to the Bilderberg meeting. And not too long after that, he was elected president. So we don't know exactly what goes on in these meetings, but we can infer some things. Certainly not everybody who appears at a Bilderberg meeting is some kind of, David Rockefeller bragged that he was a conspirator conspiring with a secret cabal against the best interests of the United States to build a one-world system, if you will, is how he wrote it in his memoirs on page 405. So not everybody who comes to Bilderberg is one of these conspirators, a member of the secret cabal. Some of them are people who have just become influential in their own right. Maybe they took over a political party. Maybe they ended up in control of a large corporation. And so the Bilderbergers will bring them in and feel them out and see if they think they're ready for the big leagues. And if you're like Bill Clinton and you're willing to sell your soul, so to speak, hey, you could be president of the United States, right? If you're not, well, you probably won't be invited back. And well, nice to meet you, good to know you, and see you later. So this happens all the time. Of course, Bilderberg is not the only one. Now, we mentioned Bohemian Grove earlier. Richard Nixon, in his own memoirs, he said the most important and memorable speech he gave prior to becoming president was at the Bohemian Grove. He said, the media didn't talk about it, but it gave me a chance to make my pitch to many of the most influential men in the world. So you're absolutely right, Dan, that despite the pretenses and despite the appearance that's given by the fake media, that we're having some kind of debate and we're going to elect our own president and so on, there are quite real shadowy forces operating behind the scenes to exert an incredible amount of influence over our elections. And that's not to say they control every election. I get the feeling that they really didn't like Trump. In fact, we know from leaked emails. Colin Powell wrote an email to the former Minister of Justice in Canada after going to Bohemian Grove. This was leaked by DC Leaks. And he said to him, hey, I sat next to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, and and everybody at Bohemian Grove pretty much agreed that Trump was a disaster, was the word that Colin Powell used. So, I'm not going to vouch for Trump necessarily, but I will say that that's a ringing endorsement if I ever heard one. And, it's just one of many, many examples. Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in his own memoirs that every foreign policy decision maker in the Carter administration came from the Trilateral Commission that he and his buddy David Rockefeller, the self-described proud conspirator, had set up for the purpose of progressing this agenda for world government. So this happens all the time. America is not unique in this respect. All over the world, similar things go on. And, we need to stop it, or at least we need to stop the pretense that, we live in a quote-unquote democracy and that we're having debates about who our leaders are going to be. They're putting puppets in front of us. They're giving a false choice that really is not a choice, and they need to be exposed. So.
Yeah, Alex, your comments about the Bilderberger, I have to tell you a personal story here. I was a county commissioner in Madison County, Montana, and in my district in Madison County, Donald Rumsfeld has a ranch here, and we had a meeting one morning with his ranch manager and one of the neighbors and Donald Rumsfeld to talk about road issues over in that district. And it was really interesting because I think Mr. Rumsfeld must have had some sort of a dossier on me, because the conversation led to a discussion about the Bilderberger Group, and I didn't initiate it. I was just listening. But Donald Rumsfeld talked about how the Bilderberger Group, although all these people have these crazy conspiracy theories about them, it's really just a group of old men that get together, and they really don't shape policy or determine leadership at all. And then in the same statement, he talked about how he had been sent there by Jerry Ford as a, I guess, a part of the Bilderberger, a member during his administration, and that's where he met a freshman led member of the House of Commons, which was Margaret Thatcher. Obviously, that kind of killed the whole concept that these people don't shape our leadership at all. They obviously shape our leadership. If Donald Rumsfeld and Margaret Thatcher, at the time fairly unknown, were at the Bilderberger conference, obviously they were being selected. So this pretty fascinating story anyway. But yeah, let's get back on to the different secret societies. John, would you like to talk about how so many of these organizations are influencing our financial sector, our job sector, so many different areas of our society?
Yeah, there are so many things that we could discuss, but I wanted to at least continue a little bit with the history of this whole cabal that we're talking about here. I talked about Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini started the Carbonari in Italy in 1810, and his goal was world government. He had different ways of going about it than did Weishaupt, and they clashed somewhat, but Weishaupt was still operating, still living at the time when Mazzini arose. But what Mazzini did was he started organizations in various countries called Young Something. It was Young Germany, Young France, Young Italy, Young this, Young that, and even Young America. He started a group in our country called Young America. Now, Mazzini was a foul individual who had an awful lot of impact. One of the most interesting things about Giuseppe Mazzini is to jump ahead to a man named Edward Mandell House, who was President Wilson's chief advisor and himself a Marxist. But he wrote a book in 1912 called Philip Drew, Administrator. And in his book, the dedicatory quote was quoting Giuseppe Mazzini. So while most Americans didn't know anything about Giuseppe Mazzini, certainly Edward Mandell House did, and it connects him to the conspiracy that began in the Illuminati of 1776 and then the Carbonari in 1810. The quote by Mazzini, I think, is extremely relevant because House, who was quoting from Mazzini, went on to form the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, that hasn't been mentioned, but I know Alex could wax eloquently about it. I would myself. The Council on Foreign Relations is the American version of the conspiracy of the Illuminati. And it has operated in our country since 1921. It was formed because the U.S. Senate said no to the League of Nations, and that was in 1919. At that point, House and British counterparts started the two organizations in their countries. The British started the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Americans, House, and John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, Sumner Wells, and several others formed the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Council on Foreign Relations has dominated American political scene for all these years, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. So there's a connection here between House and Wilson that is very obvious. There have even been books written about that. But another point that has to be made here is that House's book called Philip Drew Administrator, outlining the fact that he wanted socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, how he hated the U.S. Constitution and its limitations on government and so forth. A copy of that book was given to Franklin Roosevelt in 1920 by his own mother. Mother of Franklin Roosevelt was a friend of Edward Mandell House, and the two obviously agreed about the need to destroy the American Constitution and to bring us into the New World Order. And that phrase itself is another thing we could talk about. So in 1932, Roosevelt won the nomination of the Democrat Party in a convention held in Chicago. And the convention had put out a manifesto of sorts that was quite conservative. And Roosevelt, oh, yeah, I'm in favor of that. Sure, that's wonderful. But, of course, it was a lie. He left the convention in Chicago and headed back east. He's from New York. And he went right past his own home to go up to Gloucester, Massachusetts, to visit an old man at his vacation villa. He visited Edward Mandell House. The first person he went to see after he got the nomination of the Democrat Party in 1932 was Edward Mandell House, the founder of the Council on Foreign Relations. So then Roosevelt invited many Council on Foreign Relations members into his cabinet and so forth, and we know about the Roosevelt administration. But it all ties together. And there are several other very important indications where the subject of the Illuminati was mentioned. Let me just mention this one here. 1953, there is a California Senate Committee on Education headed by a man named Dilworth, and they put out a report called the Dilworth Report. Now, 1953. Here's what they said in California in 1953, the California Senate Committee on Education. They said, so-called modern communism is apparently the same hypocritical and deadly world conspiracy to destroy civilization that was founded by the secret order of the Illuminati in Bavaria on May 1st of 1776, and that has raised its hoary head in our colonies at critical periods before the adoption of our federal Constitution. So here's corroboration from that Senate committee in California about the effect of the Illuminati on our country. There's much more that could be said, but I know we only have so much time. Alex, you probably know about that, the Dilworth Report.
About which report, Jack? I'm sorry.
The Dilworth Report, 1953 in California.
No, I'm not familiar with it, actually.
Well, we got to chat. I got some things that I can send to you. I didn't know you were out speaking on this subject, but I'm glad to know it.
Anything you can send would be much appreciated. So.
Yeah, well, there's several things that I can. You heard me talking about the Mazzini quote in Edward Mandell House's book.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, John, you're referring to so-called Colonel Edward Mandell House, and incidentally, he was never in the military. He gave himself that title.
Yeah, he's like the Kentucky Fried Chicken Colonel.
But in any case, I have to mention this: Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who by many on the so-called right are very familiar with Teddy Roosevelt, and they laud him as being one of their heroes, when in fact Teddy Roosevelt was the founder of the Progressive Socialist Party, which was known as the Bull Moose Party in the United States. And
that's true. And if he hadn't,
you couldn't slide a piece of paper between his political philosophy and his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt.
Right. And if Teddy Roosevelt had not entered as a third-party candidate in 1912, House and Wilson would never have taken over the White House. It would have stayed away from them. But so Teddy was used, at least. I don't know that he was fully aware of what he was doing, but his entry into that election in 1912 solidified it for Wilson. And then Wilson went ahead and gave us the Communist Manifesto's demands for a income tax, for a central bank like the Federal Reserve, for the takeover of the school systems in our country, and so on. The pattern is all there, and I've tried to do this in speeches that I've given on the subject, and I'm glad to know that a younger man named Alex Newman is now doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And Alex, you're in my mind one of the really bright stars of our younger generation. That I'm absolutely proud to know you. Would you like to maybe talk about how some of these groups, the research that you've done on them, and how we've slipped into a system that's pretty much controlled by in a way that most people have no idea or really understand?
I'm sorry, you kind of came in and out there, Dan. Could you repeat the question?
Yes. What I was saying is that I'd like to have you kind of talk to our listeners about your perception of how the modern political process is being controlled by these groups, and how, without our knowledge, we've pretty much lost control of our own political process.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Well, thank you, Dan, for the opportunity. And, I think it's impossible to understand the political process or policy making in the United States, especially when it comes to foreign affairs and foreign policy, without understanding the Council on Foreign Relations. I think Jack just gave a marvelous description of the origins of the CFR. But, the CFR today is the center for policy making. Unfortunately, they've even slipped into the Trump administration. We have a number of CFR members in his cabinet. And, I think the guy who best described how the CFR has hijacked the policy-making process is actually Admiral Chester Ward. If you're looking at people who were on the inside, he was in the CFR for 16 years. He came out and he wrote extensively about them, what they were doing, trying to expose their operations and their machinations. Wrote a book with Phyllis Schlafly called Kissinger on the Couch, and he really gave us some detailed insight into how it works. So one of the things that I found especially interesting is that he described an inner core within the CFR, because clearly not all the people in the CFR really understand what's going on here. I mean, they have plenty of people there for window dressing. Angelina Jolie comes to mind. I had nothing. She has too much ideology when it comes to globalism. She seems to go along with the program, but I certainly don't imagine she's some kind of secret conspirator running all this. But generally speaking, Admiral Chester Ward described this process whereby the CFR, or at least the inner core of the CFR, which he said was dominated by the Rockefeller brothers, interestingly, and he said they come up with a policy that they want, and they start broadcasting it in foreign affairs, their mouthpiece, their chief propaganda organ, and this message then gets out to all the CFR members, the life members, the term members, all the subscribers to Foreign Affairs magazine, which is basically the policy-making community, especially when it comes to foreign affairs, and a lot of the people who are kind of hangers-on, wannabes, people who want to think they're important, people who want to spout the party line in hopes of someday getting promoted up the ranks of the machine or the deep state, if you will, people who recognize that this is where their bread is buttered, and if they want to move up the hierarchy, then they'd better be towing the party line. They recognize that foreign affairs is the place to get the party line, so to speak. And so, as Admiral Ward describes it, once they decide on a policy, they set into motion this massive apparatus they have. So they'll start doing research, they'll start putting out policy statements, they'll start trying to discredit the opposition, right, using some combination of ridicule and attacks and supposedly logical or reasonable arguments, to the point where it's just assumed, if the CFR has some kind of presupposition or assumption upon which it's basing its policy agenda. It's just assumed to be true by the CFR people and their hangers-on, and it's just talked about as if it were a done deal, as if it were self-evident. And this makes its way through the policy-making bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., through the State Department primarily, or through the foreign aid agencies, or whichever bureau we happen to be talking about. And, that's essentially how they do it. And they're very careful in presidential elections. They don't want to give us too much choice. So they have, and I think the recent GOP election was especially interesting because I don't think it worked out as they planned. That they had a lot of useful idiots in the running, so to speak. A lot of rhinos, a lot of establishment types, and a lot of people who, at least on the surface, appear to be decent conservatives. And I think the hope is that as needed, they can drop or add candidates to try to get the numbers to look how they want them to look. And certainly we've seen that in the Democrat Party. In fact, now from some of the leaks and some of the hacking that went on, we know how they had Hillary Clinton win the primary, and it wasn't exactly what you might call honest and transparent and above board. So they do hijack the political system. They're not always successful, and they certainly have hijacked the policy-making process. So two elements of my presentation that I gave last night on the deep state, two of the arms of the deep state, as I have described it. You have, on the one hand, the bureaucracy, right? And the bureaucracy is largely led by, if not, insiders and establishment types, people who someday hope to become insiders or establishment types. And so, they recognize that if they want to, go places in life, so to speak, that they'd better do, what the party line is. And then you have the intelligence agencies, which, of course, are all controlled by these types of people. I shouldn't say all, because there's 16 of them, and occasionally you'll have an honorable person running one of them. But if you look at people like Keith Alexander, who was running the NSA, I mean, this guy's a Bilderberger. He's a Council on Foreign Relations guy. If you look at Michael Hayden, who ran both the CIA and the NSA, who I have a video of him, I showed it last night, bragging about how they kill people with metadata. I mean, this guy's confessing to mass murder on video, and then they laugh about it as if it's something funny. Oh, we kill people based on metadata. So this guy, of course, is a Bilderberg attendee. He's a member of the CFR, and they have the intelligence agencies doing a lot of the dirty work. And so parts of that I explained in my presentation. Operation Mockingbird, we have the declassified documents now. The CIA was recruiting pseudo-journalists and media executives to spout the party line in the press. The Washington Post seems to be an organ of that. It's now owned by Jeff Bezos, another Bilderberger, who he has massive contracts with the CIA worth way more than what he paid for the dying rag, the Washington Post. And so that's a little bit of a glimpse into how the process works, how they dominate policymaking and the political sphere, especially at the federal level.
Right, and I know there's a famous quote of Hillary Clinton when she was talking about her speech before the Council on Foreign Relations, that somebody, I don't know if they did it on a cell phone or what, but they got a copy of it, and when she was at the CFR, she made the statement, well, I've come down here so that I could get my more orders on what we're supposed to be doing. And that's a paraphrase, but that was pretty much the gist of what she was saying, and that was when she was Secretary of State. So it gives us a pretty good glimpse into just exactly how powerful the Council on Foreign Relations and some of these groups really are. Jack, would you like to talk about how the influence of the education system came to be? You talked about early on about how the Council on Foreign Relations and how Edward Mandell House took into account the policies under a socialist system in creating the Council on Foreign Relations. But I know at the same time there was also an effort to corrupt our education system by teaching socialism. Can you give us a little bit of a glimpse into that?
I certainly can. I have a book sitting right here in front of me. I just reached for it in my library. The book is called Toward Soviet America, written by the man who was the head of the Communist Party in the United States. He's writing a book about what needs to be done in 1932 to have America become a communist state. It's quite revealing. The book was so revealing, in fact, that the communists eventually took it out and wouldn't publish it anymore. Wouldn't allow it to be spread about. But then it was reprinted outside of the communist orbit, just to let people know in America what the communists were doing and what they were planning. William Z. Foster, again, was the head of the Communist Party in the United States for many years, and we're talking about 1932 when his book came out. On page 316 of his book, he wrote this: among the elementary measures the American Soviet government will adopt to further the Cultural Revolution are the following. The schools, colleges, and universities will be coordinated and grouped under a National Department of Education and its state and local branches. The studies will be revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois ideology. Now, I don't think it's really that necessary to tell anybody that that has happened, that all of that has happened in the American educational system. And it was something urged by William Z. Foster, the head of the Communist Party, in his book in 1932. The book is called Toward Soviet America. And again, under a National Department of Education, we didn't have a National Department of Education until the Carter administration in the late 1970s. But we have succeeded. We now have a National Department of Education, and that National Department of Education is foisting on American schools programs like No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and now the newest is Common Core, and Common Core is as destructive of sound education as anything you could possibly imagine. And I know Alex is much more conversant on that subject than I am. So maybe you could take it over, Alex, and talk a little bit about what has happened in the educational world.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Jack. So yeah, this corruption of education actually began quite some time ago. You might trace it back to Horace Mann if you wanted to be really ambitious. He was a Unitarian, and at first he was interested in getting Christ out of the schools and using the schools to equalize men. He said, getting the Bible out of schools under the guise of removing sectarianism. And he also introduced a number of other changes that were, just terrible, including the sight word method of teaching reading that we now know is a leading cause of illiteracy and reading disability. But, the real effort by the insiders, the conspiracy, if you will, to take charge of education really began in earnest over a century ago with a guy called John Dewey. Now, he got a lot of money from the Rockefellers. I'm talking millions and millions of dollars, back when millions and millions of dollars was real money, from one of the Rockefeller philanthropies called the General Education Board. And they used it. They figured out that the best way to do it, the most effective way to do it, would be to take charge of the teaching colleges, because the teaching colleges are going to be training the teachers and the teachers of the teachers. And so if you want to dumb down and indoctrinate the population, that's the way to go. Now, to his credit, Dewey was not hiding his ideology, so to speak, right? He was actually pretty open about the fact that he was a socialist, that he wanted a communist America. He was pretty proud of the USSR, thought they were doing great things. He was a humanist. He was one of the original drafters and signers of the very first Humanist Manifesto. And, for some perspective on that, they don't even beat around the bush. They tell you right in the very first plank that we believe the universe is eternally self-existing and not created. And, if you read the first words of your Bible, it's pretty clear. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So they basically tell you right off the bat, we disagree with the Bible. We disagree with even the notion of God. In fact, these people rejected. They believed in evolutionism, and they believed that we needed a global government, that we needed to get rid of private property rights. So, to his credit, he wasn't lying about his beliefs and his agenda. He told us. He wrote essays about it. He talked about this pretty openly. That's probably one of the reasons why the Rockefellers were so fond of his agenda. then the big foundations got involved as well. And some of this came out in the Reese Committee, or the Cox Committee. This was an investigative committee set up by Congress in the early 1950s to investigate these big foundations. And I encourage people to go read about this investigation, read the report. There's an excellent interview by G. Edward Griffin with the chief of staff, the head of the investigators for this committee. His name was Norman Dodd, and he gave this interview shortly before he died. And some of the findings include the idea that these mega foundations were using their grant-making capabilities and these huge fortunes that they had acquired that were now in tax-sheltered accounts to hijack the educational process. And in fact, this committee had concluded that a revolution had already occurred in the United States and that it would not have been possible without having corrupted the education system. So they were teaching moral relativism, they were teaching internationalism, they were teaching socialism. The committee found that these organizations, these tax-exempt foundations, were funding subversive activities and subversion. And, that's all in the rearview mirror. We're now at the point where they're teaching little children just abominable perversions, brainwashing them to hate America, to hate Christians, to hate the Bible. And so we're in a very precarious situation at this point. And the establishment figures, hey, another generation or two, 90% of the population will be so dumbed down they won't even recognize what's happening. They'll be so indoctrinated they'll be begging for their slavery. And so we're in a very dangerous situation at this point because these people can just wait around for the older generations to die off and we'll vote ourselves into slavery. And so that's what they're counting on. And this was all accomplished through the education system. And we shouldn't even really call it education. It's an indoctrination program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of was traditional education in this country has now become nothing more than indoctrination and a way to create good, reliable workforce. And that was stated very early on, Alex. And I think your comments about how far we've fallen down the hill from where we started out, I just ask our listeners, look up the Communist Manifesto, look at the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, and then take a look at how many of those planks are actually in place right now. Virtually all of them are in one form or another, and the only thing that we have left of those planks that isn't really almost completely in place is the abolition of private property. We still have an understanding in the United States of America that we are to have private property rights. However, our system is being taxed to the point where we really are no more private landowners than we're really tenants on our own land, and the government milks us like a cow. John, your comments about early on about the way the Illuminati have shifted the paradigm in the United States and how all that came into play in the really in the last 2 centuries. Can you talk to our listeners about how you see the America of 2050 if we continue to go down the road that we're on right now, where we'll be and what we need to be doing to protect ourselves from this?
Well, by the time 2050 rolls around, which is, of course, maybe 33 years from now, our country will either no longer exist, it'll simply be a province in a one-world system, or the conspiracy will have been exposed and routed, and we will get back to real Americanism. Real Americanism can be summed up very easily. I like to say America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the U.S. Constitution. If the Constitution were fully enforced as it exists even today, federal government would be 20% its size and 20% its cost. And wouldn't that be wonderful? We wouldn't be stationing American forces in 130 different nations around the world. We would be out of the United Nations and a lot of other things. But there's something that occurred to me while Alex was talking, and it's a statement made by Hillary Clinton in April of 2015. She was speaking at UN headquarters to an assemblage of women's groups, mostly lesbians, transgenders, whatever you want to call them, people who are very much in favor of the women's liberation movement and so forth. And in her speech at the UN to these women's groups in April of 2015, she said, deep-seated cultural codes, religious beliefs, and structural biases have to be challenged. Deep-seated cultural codes have to go out. Religious beliefs have to be overcome. Structural biases have to be changed. That's what Hillary Clinton said, and she was applauded by the females that were at this meeting at the UN. It's an incredible indictment of Hillary Clinton, and it ought to be much more better known. Now, another thing that should be known is this. When you have a secret organization, you have to kind of set up a system where those who are members of it can find out if the people that they're talking to and they're with are also members of the secret organization. So you have secret handshakes, you have secret this, you have secret that, and so forth. And one of the keys is the use of the phrase New World Order. New World Order is kind of a signal. If you're in favor of the New World Order and you're proud of it, then you're signaling to a lot of other people who are part of the conspiracy that this is what your goal is and that the goals of the conspiracy are yours. New World Order is, in Latin, novus ordo seclorum. And I think a lot of Americans have seen that phrase. They've wondered what it meant, and they've wondered why it was there. It's in the Great Seal of the United States, which is on the backside of a $1 bill. Anybody who's listening, take out a $1 bill, and you'll see the phrase novus ordo seclorum. It's Latin. It means new order of the ages, and it has been freely translated New World Order. Now, it's there, and part of the Great Seal of the United States, put together in the 1780s, it's a pyramid with the all-seeing eye at the top. That's another symbol of the Illuminati. At the bottom of the pyramid, you will see Roman numbers, and it adds up to 1776. And, of course, if you know Roman numbers and you look at that, you might say, well, that's because of the 4th of July of 1776, where our country declared its independence. The answer is no. No, it's because of May 1st, 1776, and the creation of the Illuminati. And that's part of the Great Seal of the United States, which was put together during our country's leadership under the Articles of Confederation. The hints of a conspiracy are all around us, and the John Birch Society has been trying very hard to get people to appreciate these hints of conspiracy in order to be able to block it and stop its effect on our country. What has happened to the John Birch Society in the process, it has been labeled, it has been tar-brushed, it has been given a bad name, a bad reputation by the mass media that is a puppy dog for the conspiracy. So the John Birch Society soldiers on, and we continue to warn people about the conspiracy to rule mankind, and we want very much to break it up and to get back to the Constitution of the United States. So I've been waxing eloquent here. Let me, if I may, also mention one other thing. In 1920, June 19th to be specific, 1920, the newspaper, the Christian Science Monitor, published an editorial which was an exposure of the Illuminati. And it talked the editorial about John Robeson and his book, and it talked about the goals of the Illuminati. the Christian Science Monitor said that these goals included the obliteration of Christianity, the deification of sensuality, the proscription of property, the abjuration of all religion and morality, the repudiation of marriage, and as a necessary corollary, the state adoption of children, universal license and the wrecking of civilization and giving over of society to general plunder. That's what the Christian Science Monitor summarized the writings of John Robeson, the man who wrote in 1798. I had an interesting thing happen. I had this Christian Science Monitor article, and I knew a man in the John Birch Society who was himself a Christian Scientist. He believed in that religion. So I went to him and I told him about it, and I gave him a copy that I had typed up, and he was fascinated by it. 1 month later, I saw this same man again, and he told me that he had done some research on the subject and found out that his own father had written the editorial, which was quite interesting. And he was so grateful to me to have pointed this out to him and so forth. But that editorial in the Christian Science Monitor in 1920 is very, very important, and it certainly does do a good job in exposing the Illuminati. 1920, incidentally, was the same year I quoted Winston Churchill earlier and his comments about it. So we see the Illuminati progressing. The Illuminati in the United States today is the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and so forth, and some other organizations that we probably don't even know. But these are enough. The American people knew what the Council on Foreign Relations was and its grip on our country. It would be exposed and it would be routed in short order. And that's what we try to do in the John Birch Society.
Well, and I think you've done a terrific job in giving that information to the American people. The John Birch Society, as you say, has been demonized to a certain extent, certainly a lot by the mainstream media. And in fact, you don't deal with conspiracy theories. You deal with conspiracy facts.
Correct.
And that is, there's a lot of difference between theories and facts.
Yes, there is. And one of the things that you'll find today, ordinary American will begin to talk to a neighbor, a friend, and maybe even a relative about some of the things that they've learned. And the response will be immediately, oh, you sound like a conspiracy theorist. The first job of a conspiracy, said James Lucia years ago, is to convince the world that conspiracies don't exist. And that has been happening, and there's a lot of people who don't even want to consider, they'll consider a conspiracy about something of a minor nature, or something. Not a conspiracy to rule the world, not a conspiracy that has the goals of the Illuminati and so forth that we've talked about here. So what does an ordinary American have to do about this? He has to learn about it. He has to learn about it, and probably one of the best sources of information on that subject would be a book that we published. I think it's in its 19th printing today. It's called The Shadows of Power, written by a man named James Perloff, who's a good old friend of mine, and we're so happy that he finally put all his thoughts together in that book. The Shadows of Power by James Perloff, Perloff. I think, Alex, you'd recommend that as well.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the most important introductory books for people who want to understand what's happened to our country and who some of the leading characters are in that process. So I can't recommend it highly enough.
Same here.
And I agree with that. I've also read it several times, and it's probably one of the best introductions to the secret societies that anyone can run into. So we're getting toward the end of the show here. I do want to mention that Debbie Boscalupi is going to be doing her radio show tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Monday mornings, we also having Jim White with his radio program. We're trying to build a lineup here on the micro effect that is really powerful in exposing a lot of these issues that Americans need to wake up to. And the program that Debbie does is a kind of a takeoff. We're all working together to try to expose as much as we can. Please tune in tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for her show as well. And I think you'll find us and the people on her program very interesting, just like on our program. So, Alex, I'd like to, maybe the last couple of minutes here, I'd like to talk about how the environmental movement and how radical environmentalism is the new Trojan horse in our society, and how they are using that to force us into a world government system. I think you could probably give us a good idea.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan. And yeah, I've been to a good number now of these UN conferences on sustainable development and global warming, and it's very clear at this point that this is one of the key vehicles being used to advance this the agenda of the conspiracy that we're talking about here. I mean, the assaults on private property, for example. They say, oh, private property rights are bad, and that leads to pollution, and that leads to bad environmental problems, so we need to curtail private property rights. When the opposite is true. Private property rights have consistently shown all over the world to be an incredible protector of the environment, whereas collectivization and collectivism has been shown always and everywhere to be absolutely devastating to the environment. Go visit the former Soviet Union. Go visit some of the Central Asian states. Go visit China. I mean, who do they think they're kidding? But they've been so transparent about this. It's just phenomenal to me. It's almost like they're just so arrogant. They just come out and tell you to your face. The Gorbachev, for example, after the ostensible collapse of communism, and that's a story for another day, he came out and he talked about how sustainability and the environment needed to be the new underpinning of the system. The Club of Rome came out with a report in 1991, right around that time. Al Gore, Gorbachev, the Rockefellers, all these billionaire bigwigs and communist bigwigs, and the Gores of the world and the Gorbachevs of the world, they came out and they said, we needed to come up with a new enemy, and we decided on global warming and the threat of environmental degradation. The enemy then is humanity itself. And if you go to their conferences, it comes through loud and clear. They consider humans to be bad. If you're a Christian, if you believe the Bible, it says, in Genesis, God told people to be fruitful and to multiply and to subdue the earth. And what these globalists want is essentially the exact opposite. Less people, don't subdue the earth. We're going to lock up all the land in the world as some kind of wilderness reserve, and we're going to pack all the humans into these little smart cities where they can be constantly surveilled and monitored and controlled, and their consumption and their production measured and gauged and tabulated. We're moving into a very totalitarian world, and this environmental agenda is the key. And we talked a little bit about the foundations earlier. In fact, the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee came out with a report documenting this just a few years ago about, they called it the Billionaires Club, that was using these foundations to really create the green movement from nothing. And when we talk about green, we really should be talking about watermelons, and that's not my term, but they're green on the outside, but they're red on the inside. And that's come through loud and clear at this point. We absolutely need to resist this agenda. We need to expose this agenda, and we need the help of all the listeners. Please get involved. Help distribute these materials. Help wake up your neighbors. Get organized. Get active. Call your member of Congress. Work with your state legislator to make sure that we can resist these things at the state level. Alabama gave the nation a wonderful example of how that can be done. Every member of the state legislature, every Republican, every Democrat voted to ban Agenda 21 in their state. They banned any cooperation between state and local governments with these tentacles of the insiders, and that was a wonderful mechanism. If we could get every state in the country to do that, that would be big progress in exposing and setting back this agenda. So please, listeners, get involved. Don't take our word for it, right? Go and do the research yourself. I'm very confident that if you're intellectually honest, you'll come to the same conclusions, and you'll realize the urgency of getting involved right now.
No,
it's time for a commercial.
Right.
Time for a commercial from the John Birch Society.
And Jack, I'd like to give you maybe the last word on this, but we need our listeners to wake up. We need to get America to wake up to the reality that we've come a long way down the wrong path. And
That's
it's
right.
time that Americans do their own research, their own learning and reading, and wake up to the reality that we have allowed this to happen ourselves. And we've done it because we've been so weak in our response to protect our own liberties.
Correct.
John, go ahead. I'm sorry.
All right, well, a little commercial here. The John Birch Society can be located on the internet, jbs.org, and from there you can order books, you can order booklets, you can order DVDs, you can order things that I've written, things that Alex Newman has written, and a lot of our colleagues. jbs.org. So we look forward to hearing from a lot of the listeners. Certainly what we've thrown at you today is a history lesson that encompasses years and years of research on my part and on Alex's part, and we've just barely touched the surface. There's an awful lot more, but there's something that every American can do, and that is to get informed and start informing others, and let's take our country back. Take our country back. Donald Trump has said, make America great again. Well, it can be great again just by going back to the Constitution of the United States and limited government. Dan, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to your audience, and let's do it again. Alex, give me a call. We'll share some of the...
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you, Dan.
All right, well, gentlemen, thank you again, and that's a great lead-in for the next show. So we have only scratched the surface, and I just want to make sure that our listeners realize it's up to them to do the research themselves. Don't believe anything we've said. Just do your own research, and you'll find out whether we're being truthful or not. And I believe you'll find out that we're being so truthful that it's almost frightening. But with that, Alex, thank you, and John, thank you, and I'll look forward to the next meeting.